Welcome to our interview series on Technology Impact Assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a visiting scientist at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and also a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute here in Australia. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project, funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia and our Indian counterparts. And it's an ongoing grant since November 2024, reaching its conclusion this year in November 2025. And in this series, we're focusing on technology impact assessment for peace and stability. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a well-known figure in the space of technology assessment and also a colleague of mine in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, based out of Washington, D.C. In the US, it's Dr. Robert Cook-Deegan, MD. And as I said, Bob is in the School for the Future of Innovation, also a member of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. Uh, an amazing history. I'm going to read it all out just for context in this interview. He was at Duke University from 2002 to 2016. After a career in Washington at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine from 91 to 2002. Interestingly, he also was at the National Center for the Human Genome Project from 1989 to 1990. And most importantly, in the context of this interview, he was in the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment from 1982 to 1988. And his research interests today include science policy, health policy, biomedical research, cancer, and intellectual property. He's also the author of the well-known book, The Gene Wars, Science, Politics, and the Human Genome, and more than 350 publications. I'm sure it's about 400 now, Bob, but welcome.
Thanks, Kat. Look forward to it.
I want to start with your disciplinary background. You're the only doctor so far I've interviewed or about to interview. Tell us what brought you into the field of technology impact assessment or technology assessment more broadly as you ventured into the space of medicine.
So, my introduction to technology assessment was as a fellow in 1982. I was brought to Washington straight out of a molecular biology lab that was studying oncogenes. And before that, I'd done work on Alzheimer's disease. Um, and I did it in lieu of doing a postdoc in genetics that would have taken me down a completely different career path. Um, but the postdoc that I was going to do was at the University of Utah, which was emerging as the power center for genetics and doing the first genetic linkage map. Um, and my wife didn't want to live in Salt Lake City, so we had to come up with another solution. And I saw an ad in Science Magazine and applied for a fellowship. And by unbelievable luck, I ended up being a fellow at the Office of Technology Assessment, which had been created in the 70s. The bill that created it was 1972, but it got up and operating around 1974. So it was early years. It was about 6 years in. But by the time I had arrived, OTA, the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, which really was part of the U.S. Congress, but it wasn't one of the regular committees. It was a separate organization that was governed by a congressional board that was half Democrat and half Republican, regardless of the elections. It was always exactly balanced between the Senate and the House and between Republicans and Democrats. So it was systematically bipartisan and bicameral. Um, and I had the first job that I really, really enjoyed. I'd had several jobs in research and stuff like that. And I liked research. I loved the intellectual part of research, but I was not a golden hands person. I wasn't a great experimentalist. And it turned out that my talents were much more in reading things and explaining things and writing things for non-technical audiences, which is what the U.S. Congress is, because it's heavily dominated by lawyers and generalists, as opposed to the world that I emerged from in molecular biology, which is where everybody works 70 hours a week and is completely monomaniacally focused on a really narrow technical discipline. Um, so I was really, really happy to be reading the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal every morning as part of my job, and also reading Science and Nature, especially the news sections. Um, and I arrived in Washington, D.C., and took a position at OTA OTA was under new leadership, and it was beginning to build its credibility that increased until it was killed in the mid 1990s. I was gone for 6 years before OTA met its demise in the Gingrich Revolution after the elections of 1995 or 1994. Um, but my acquaintance with technology assessment was basically coming straight out of a highly technical background and landing in an environment where I was supposed to be talking to people whose lives were politics. And it turned out that was both scary and fun because I had not taken a government course
Yeah,
I think I took one government course in college. Um, I was a chem major and then went straight to medical school. Um, so it was a new environment, and the technology assessment movement, just to speak a little bit about what OTA was
yes,
and what
please.
it did, is it was the interface between the political system. Our client was Congress, but the best way to reach Congress is actually to speak to the general public and to the media and put technical stuff in a non-technical um, context and explain complicated things in the framework of saying, what choices do we face? You folks on the Hill who are
Mm,
writing laws and spending money, what are you going to have to do about this thing that's happening? And sometimes it's a big problem for which technology is a partial solution. How do we solve this problem and how does the technology work? Sometimes it's an emerging technology. And that's the focus. Like when the Human Genome Project came out, the debate was who's going to run it and should we do it at all? And that was really focused on a particular technology, as opposed to the other project that I worked on quite closely, which was on Alzheimer's disease. And the question there is not Alzheimer's disease is not a technology. But technology was going to be an inherent part of any solution to this problem of why does this disease destroy people's brains and make their lives and their families' lives miserable? Um, so what can we do about that in our government to ameliorate that problem? And is it going to get better or is it going to get worse? So those were the sorts of things that OTA was contending with, the role of technology in solving social problems and mediating the discussion of what was going on in highly technical domains for a non-technical audience. And at the same time, by the time I arrived, OTA had figured out that we also needed to be speaking to the general public. So we needed to be writing in very clear, non-technical prose and have a specific communications plan for reaching the public media because that's the best way to influence policymakers. So that's probably enough about how I got into it. I
that's
got into it by immersion, basically.
well, I think uh, you describe the importance of being able to speak to people from different disciplines, different sectors, the communication flows that are required between stakeholders, and this whole process. It was very crystal clear in your description there. Um, did you, when you arrived at OTA, find that there were processes in place for different things that you just described? Was there a process to conduct a technology assessment? Were there rubrics in place, or were there uh, nuanced kinds of applications that you could, for example, with digital technologies, or in your case, molecular biology or otherwise?
So That sounds like a simple question, but it's not a simple question. The,
Mm,
the spirit of OTA, and I think you could say this about the spirit of technology assessment in general, was there is a general framework of we kind of have a job to do, which is scan the horizon, and at OTA particularly present options to the people who actually are going to make the decisions because we're not elected. We're just filtering information for the people who are and have to make those decisions. Um, so the job was clear, but how to do that job right was not at all clear. And frankly, the methods were evolving. So um, you mentioned I'm a physician. I was at OTA, but I was actually not in the health program at OTA. I was next door in the part that did, it was called biological applications, and biotechnology was emerging as a hot issue. And we tended to do science policy and biotechnology, and the health program did technology assessment for health issues. And in fact, that's almost a divide in this term. Technology assessment means very different things in different domains. In
mm,
health, technology assessment has become a tool for many governments, not including ours anymore. Um, but OTA, the health program at OTA was one of the most influential and powerful at OTA because they were basically watching these new miraculous things that come out of
mm,
biomedical innovation and saying, do they work? How much do they cost? And are they worth investing in? And if so, how much? So
mm-hmm.
they were pioneers of doing cost effectiveness analysis, risk benefit analysis, and all that. Those tools were beginning to be sharpened in the world of academe, and places like OTA applied those new technologies that are basically sophisticated methods of social science,
Yes.
both qualitative and quantitative, and applying them to emerging technologies very specifically to inform choices about what should Medicare or Medicaid pay for. Does it make sense to pay for it and how much? So there was a whole line of research, and that's been taken up in other parts of the world. And in the US, we do have the nonprofit Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research, ICER, that does a lot of technology assessment, but it's a very specific subset. The rest of OTA was usually engaged in either assessing technologies that were like there was a computer program, there was a ag program, we were doing biotech, um, and we were following different aspects of those. But there was also a strain of work that here's an emerging problem. The example I already gave was Alzheimer's disease,
Mm-hmm.
but also all sorts of stuff in national security. OTA was a place that one the I didn't even realize it, but before I came to OTA, I'd been involved in human rights and Physicians for Social Responsibility and stuff like that. And I'd read an OTA report that I didn't even know was from OTA, which is
Mm,
about the impact of an atomic bomb going over New York. This was
yes.
just a shattering, like, oh my gosh, this is a big deal. It was a technical assessment of what would happen if a bomb went off.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it was a touchstone of the anti-nuclear movement, um, coming out of this little agency that was part of the U.S. Congress. So it was that sort of stuff that was going on. Those methods were there was almost a resistance to adopting a particular rubric, or
Mm-hmm.
checkbox, or have you done blah 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 blah. But at the same time, there was a lot of attention to making sure that there was rigor in the work. So, because I was a fellow that year, I went to the first retreat of the senior leadership. OTA had not had a retreat in 6 years
Right.
of its senior management. And because we were very junior staff and kind of temporary, we were 1 year wonders, that were brought in from the outside. We were invited to be the rapporteurs for this first meeting of
Right.
the guts of OTA, the leadership of OTA. And I still remember graphically that one of the issues that came up was how do we know that we're doing anything useful?
Yeah.
How do we know we've got any impact? Um, and that actually started a process of OTA doing self-evaluations periodically. And one of the coolest things about OTA was it was a very self-critical institution.
Hmm.
So you asked about were there methods, was there a rubric? Not really. And there was some resistance to that, but at the same time, there was a fair amount of accountability for and a systematic effort to keep improving the system and learning from our mistakes and being honest about those mistakes. There was a lot of kind of brutal, self-critical stuff going on in the background. And it
I,
was really, I've never worked in another institution instantly, even in academia, where we love to
yeah.
yell at each other.
Yeah.
But not in the same way. It wasn't how are we going to achieve this goal? Um,
That's just fantastic and refreshing to hear. I mean, if only I was a fly on the wall. Uh, we have been grappling with ideas like this, and of course, we also concur there is no rubric, but there is a framework you can point to, scope questions, who
yeah,
is the sponsor questions and strategic choices and evaluation. I mean, is part of our grant as well. It has to be evaluated as most grants
and
do. Go
yeah,
ahead,
and
please.
before I lose this strain, there is a systematic set of
Mm,
things that began to emerge from that thinking.
yeah.
One is to always have a chapter on history. How did we get to where we are? That
Hmm.
would explain the guts of the technologies that you're talking about, and also would explain the political history. And one of the things we discovered at OTA is number one, it's very, very important to write in clear, plain English,
Yes.
non-technical jargon. And two, we were not so good at identifying stakeholders and identifying political levers. So two things that we learned was you have to have a stakeholder map and you have to have a policy map, and you have to marry those things together. So you
Mm,
do history, stakeholder map, and policy map. Those are things that you have to do if you're going to do a good technology assessment. How you get there is going to differ depend on the local context and the specific problem. But those general frameworks did begin to, that's how stuff works, right? When you're doing a
yes.
complicated job, you kind of look at how did we get where we were and what did we do right and wrong, and you begin to create a set of rules. And that process was very much ongoing the whole time I was at OTA.
Yes, we've been delving into methodologies, and you've already mentioned scenarios, like the scenario that you read that
Yeah,
paper, what would happen if the atomic bomb dropped in New York City, or New York per se, and the fallout from that. And then there are surveys that are quite evidence-based. I'm going to call them completely evidence-based, actually. Even scenarios can be evidence-based, but the whole question regarding rigor comes to the fore and how useful the outcomes are of a TIA or a TA to a government or to the sponsor that requested the TA in the first place. And it has to be scientific for the particularly quantitative side. There is a science behind the qualitative side, and people are working on improving these measures. But what was the most common method that you saw being applied through the TAs for data collection?
well, yeah, so the first thing you always do is a literature review, right? That's just,
Hmm.
you always first do the literature review. And in the case of OTA or technology assessment, you actually have to do two literature reviews at
Hmm.
least. One is on the technical literature, and the other is the political history. And you have to know both of those domains really, really well to be able to say anything useful. Um, so that was part of it. And then it's interesting, when we were doing the work on biotechnology and bioapps, we were one of the units at OTA that began to start using what have become the standard methods of qualitative social science. Things like um, you start with interviews,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because you read the literature,
Yeah.
you get to the point where you don't sound stupid when you're talking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. Um, so you start with interviews, but then sometimes you do focus groups and you do surveys.
Yes.
And Those have different functions. And the stuff that we really didn't get into at OTA until after I had left, it began to happen more after I left, is the stuff that like Mahmoud Farouk here in Washington, D.C. is so good at, which is doing systematic public deliberations where you have to get people to the point where they can make sensible choices and
Yes.
sensible things. And that takes more time than we usually took. A focus group's usually a few hours. These public deliberations take a few days,
Hmm.
and there's no way around that. We hadn't experimented with those at OTA, and I think we would if we were doing it now. Uh,
Yes.
but we did start adopting the techniques of uh, qualitative social science. But the thing that I learned after we'd done the Alzheimer's report, we then moved to the should there be a human genome report, mapping and sequencing the human genome. Um, and the thing that I'd learned by the time I directed that project was the most important thing that I needed to do as a method was actually get out of town
Mm.
and go meet people on their own turf. I had to do my homework before I did that, but go meet people, talk to them in their labs, talk to them in their social context, talk to them in their company, and ask them questions and just go on the road. I was on the road for 6 weeks,
Hmm.
going from one place, one lab or one company or one expert to another. And I just spent 6 weeks immersing myself in the culture of the issue that I was trying to address. And that then created a social network, and information began to flow from all those sources who knew my name, knew what I was trying to do, knew that it was important that Congress know what they were doing. And
Yes.
it just became a natural flow of information that was generated by going out into the world and talking to people. And I think that's the most powerful mechanism that I ever discovered at OTA.
Almost, you're describing there. Of course, you were that critical element, allowing for that flow of information, but in fact, you built a community of practice, and as a outcome of what you were doing. You were there, inquiring about different perspectives from different stakeholders. You were conducting a multi-stakeholder consultation in situ in organizations, institutes, and wherever the public was. And I think that leads to the formation, whether we see it or not, of a community of practice where people start to get feedback loops from you as that conduit, but then even beyond your time there, I'm sure there would be still people, talking to one another from those times.
Yeah, in fact, I've done several interviews this week on the history of the Genome Project because a bunch of people are working on that,
Yeah.
and this has all come back again. But your comment about a community of practice, that term of art, this is one of the things that we've kind of lost in the United States. There
Hmm.
really isn't so much a community of practice for doing technology assessment in the United States anymore. There is in other parts of the world. um, Especially in the parts where governments have actually picked this up. I mean, the Netherlands, Denmark,
Yes.
Austria, there are all these technology assessment units all over the planet now, um, that I think are doing kind of what OTA was doing, except OTA was killed and we've never replaced it here. The the Government Accountability Office is trying to fill some of that gap.
Mm.
Um, but they're very young and trying to do that, and they're facing the same headwinds in the dysfunctional U.S. political system that everybody else is.
It's interesting. A lot of the interviews, a lot of the webinars we've hosted, they keep pointing back to the Office of Technology Assessment in the US as having been that which inspired so much for them to get going. And it's very sad that it's been closed at the time that it was. Uh, there seems to be some murmurings in the community so far that I see a resurgence. I mean, as you say, countries that you named have been steadily building the technology assessment presence in different levels of government or in different practice styles. but quite a few people have talked about it's time. It's time for this to come back seriously. There was a conference hosted in Europe just last week, I think it was, or two
Yeah.
weeks ago.
Yeah.
Uh, and
In
I
Austria.
think
Yeah.
in Austria, we're going to see this return. I think we're going to see it return and linked to existing theoretical frameworks. Uh, we're going to see greater rigor, I think, in the way technologies are assessed. And I think what's propelled that is digital capability. Um, can you say something about not just the methods of data collection, but also what was what might be the focus of critical emerging technologies? Like when you think of the term, or someone says to you, Bob, what are the critical emerging technologies today? Is there a list we should be looking at? Is it is country specific? Do you think theoretical frameworks will be linked to this new inquiry that is at least being murmured about?
Let me respond to that with a very OTA-like response to that, which is I'm not going to hazard a guess at what the hot technologies are because my domain of
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is relatively restricted. I could do that to some extent in genetics and biomedicine, and there it would be things like CRISPR and
Yes.
RNA technologies and stuff like that. Um, I think RNA is about to dethrone DNA as the miracle model of
Mm-hmm.
biology. Um, but um, the thing that I was gonna say beyond that is I think a lot of governments have taken this to heart that it's good to have a strategic sense of what's going on in the world of technology. But one of the things you said in there was the digital technologies that have enabled a lot of this. And I think that's right. I mean, one of the things I'll also observe, I was absolutely fascinated by computers. I started working with computers when we were still doing tape and
Yeah.
Hollerith cards. And I learned how to program in Fortran. So the I was fascinated by computers, and the convergence. The Human Genome Project was actually not just about DNA sequencing. It was also the convergence of that technology with digital
Mm-hmm.
technology and the emergence of computers that could sit on your desk instead of take up a room in the Census Bureau. Um, and the um, OTA was one of the places where that convergence was happening because we had clusters of tech savvy people. And I remember when the PC revolution happened and the first IBM clones came out,
Yeah.
our office and my boss, we were both kind of computer geeks also. And so we got some of the first personal computers at OTA. My first email address was bcd at OTA, period.
Mm.
There was there, and then it became .bitnet, and then it became blah blah, blah .gov.
Yeah.
But the this was before the dots, and so we were right there. And the digital technologies were, in fact, going to be incredibly powerful for enabling the flow of information. The thing I was also going to observe, though, is they are also part of the problem that makes it really, really difficult because there is so much crap and there's
Yes.
so much information that you have to dig through. And the algorithms are now so inscrutable and inherently biased in ways that you can't really tell because you don't know exactly what's going on,
Yes.
that it's also now part of the problem that needs to be penetrated in order to do a good assessment of what's really going on in the world. And I think that's one of the destabilizing effects of both social networks and AI technologies are beginning. You know a whole lot more about that than I do, but it just strikes me that the digital technologies are both enabling and disabling simultaneously.
Definitely. We've had speakers talk about data quality already, and we're only as good as our data. And quality is a big issue there. And two of the things. Let's go to CRISPR for a moment because it might actually feed in very well to the context of the technology assessments we're looking at within peace and stability realm. How can technology assessment be conducted on CRISPR, for example, today, um, with a lens towards peace and stability? Why? Why would we do that? Why would you do a technology assessment on CRISPR with respect to peace and stability? Give us some
You
some
know,
some
s-
brainstorms.
I love that question, Kat, because it's something I've thought about a lot because I've followed the CRISPR story since 2012 when the Doudna and Charpentier paper came out. And one of my students at Duke said, "Hey, this like, do you know anything about this, Bob?" No, I didn't, but he showed it to me. This is what
Yeah,
happens when you teach, right? Your
that's right.
students know
So
what's
much
going
more.
on in the world and
Yeah,
they
yeah.
tell you. So anyway, so I got really, really interested in CRISPR, and one of the first thoughts I ever had is, oh my God, this is just like DNA sequencing was when I was in med school. This
Mm,
is super hot. It's going to change the world. It's really powerful. Somebody should be thinking about what's this going to do in the real world and should be out there thinking about the policy choices that we face to
yes.
help inform that debate as it's emerging. What would the world do if OTA were around? Would we have done a technology assessment of CRISPR? Yes, absolutely. We definitely would have.
Hmm.
And w what might that have changed? Well, there are two things that I think are very specific about CRISPR is it's a platform technology that has unbelievable range of potential applications. And I think we would have done a report that would lay out what those potential application areas, because it's not just gene editing for disease, although that's the most conspicuous and most obvious, but also diagnostics and environmental applications in agriculture. And in fact, it may have much bigger applications in agriculture than it has in human biology so far. Although the clinical trials are, some of them are looking good. Um, but I think we would have done a kind of here's what it's good for. But the other thing is, I think if there'd been some folks watching, we might have avoided some of the crap that's happened in the intellectual property sphere of this
Mm,
senseless battle between the Broad Institute and the University of California, who
yeah,
went to war over who owns the rights, when in fact what they should have done was what Intel and Texas Instruments did about integrated circuits, which is do a cross-licensing agreement that everybody benefits from, and then
yeah.
they know that they can license the technology and not worry about picking sides or having to license from both groups. It was just, what Noyce and the TI guys did was brilliant, and that model existed. And I think we would have known to apply that model to CRISPR. And maybe we could have stopped the University of California from doing this lunk-headed, scorched earth, we want it all framework that has
Mm,
really complicated the business models for CRISPR. I really think that maybe having a light shining on the process
hmm.
instead of a bunch of lawyers in back rooms deciding about money might have helped change the outcome of the intellectual property story. I'm not sure. That's kind of a dream, but it strikes me that sometimes you can do stuff like that.
I love these comments and the insights. Let's take the same example now and broaden it out. So this was a US specific response. Now, imagine we're talking about US and a country in Asia. Also looking at technology assessment in their own context for peace and stability, and then looking at it more from an international focus. Do you think working with other nation states jointly on technology assessments is a plausible approach to looking at the international context of, say, CRISPR technologies and some of the worst case scenarios that could eventuate uh, if taken and used in the wrong way? If there is such a thing, I don't want to put words in your mouth in any way, but let's say there was a rogue state that wished to use CRISPR technology in a way that wouldn't be to the benefit of humankind. How can joint impact assessments work? Is CRISPR an example of where something joint between nation states could work, or even at a academic level, for example, ASU and a partner university somewhere else in the world?
Yeah, so another brilliant question. Kat, you're so good. Um, the one of the failures at OTA is it was kind of interesting. We dabbled at the edge and we almost plunged into looking at biological warfare.
Hmm.
We never really did. Um, and the reasons for that were partly financial because it was going to be expensive. We dabbled with the idea that two of us at OTA would get security clearances, and that costs a lot of money, and OTA
Yes.
didn't have a big budget. So we eventually decided not to do that, even though there was some interest in both the House and the Senate in asking us to do some work in that area. But that's it's a really, really it was already from the days of recombinant DNA, it was obvious that there were nefarious uses of biotechnologies that were quite foreseeable. And the, it came to the fore in the Iraq situation.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the reasons that we went to war was the fear that there were biological weapons in Iraq. And of course, the biopreparat situation that went on for 20 years and involved 20,000 people and tons of weaponized anthrax buried in Kazakhstan, um, that the U.S. intelligence services didn't even know about,
Mm.
which is catastrophically bad. Which leads me to address your question, which is I think one of the explicit attention to questions like that is really, really important. And it is inherently global when you're talking about security issues, military issues, and nefarious uses, because criminality is too always global, and um, and really, really nasty weapons are inherently international. So U.S. the OTA did have a national security group that was super sophisticated and very, very good. Um, But that was also part of the reason that OTA's demise happened is because of the
Mm.
reports that came out on Star Wars and casting doubt on the technical feasibility of
Mm.
spending billions of dollars on things that wouldn't work. Um, so that's part of the reason we got into trouble. The truth
Yeah.
sometimes leads to the messenger getting killed. And I think that was part of the story for OTA. I don't think that's the main thing that
Yeah, yeah.
happened at OTA, but it was a tributary that fed into the river that killed it. Um, and so I do think there's incredible value in knowing what might go wrong and thinking about that in advance. You need to be careful about that though, because by publicizing that, you may make it more likely to happen. So, and I don't know anybody who's thought through that completely or knows how to manage that, because
Yeah.
complete secrecy is really bad, but it kind of worked for nuclear technologies. It's proliferation is of nuclear proliferation has been much, much slower than if we hadn't had the secrecy surrounding nuclear technologies. But I don't think biological technologies are going to follow that path at all, and I don't think you can sequester them the way you
Yeah.
could nuclear facilities because it's so much smaller scale and it truly is just knowledge. And the knowledge is much more widely shared than it was among a whole bunch of a relatively small community of nuclear physicists. Um, so I think yeah, I think technology assessment could become a way of sensing what might go wrong in the world before it goes wrong and
Mm.
creating a social network that also makes it much more likely that if somebody is beginning to behave nefariously, there's going to be a leak that will leak into the system and people can actually begin to grapple with real world cases and do something about it before it spins out of control. So I think it's a national security in a positive sense could be
Yes.
a tool for doing that. And I think there's a lot of interest in the militaries, including the US military, in being much more adept at doing what we would have used to call technology assessment. That may
Yeah.
be the only place that has enough of a budget to do anything about it in the United States for the
Mm.
foreseeable future.
Fascinating. I find your take on the risks of self-fulfilling prophecy being that which is dangerous. Oh, here we think this might happen, or we'll take the first one, thanks, and not be if it happens. But I do like your corrective action and keeping things back on track through uh, uh, soft international pressure if someone is going the wrong way and becomes known. And there, I want to ask you a question about, the label often that we hear, whether it's privacy, impact assessments, or risk assessment, or human rights uh, uh, assessment, or whatever it is, child rights impact assessment. We often think, oh, here's the document, it's now finished. We can move on and let's go to the next technology. But do you see, and was there any aspect of your OTA work which pointed to technology assessment as an ongoing process from conception of an emerging technology right through to widespread diffusion? Was there something that pointed to the fact that technology assessment was not simply a standalone artifact, but a continuous process that had to be revisited in order to do what you're saying with regards to potentially corrective action or
Yeah,
risks that were intolerable?
yeah, that's actually part of the reason that OTA acquired a reputation.
Mm,
And a lot of that came from having expertise in paying attention to what was going on and
hmm.
translating that for folks in the political arena.
Yes,
So the answer is absolutely. Almost everything, there was a strain of work. It wasn't one report, it's a series of linked reports. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another.
got
And
it.
that is the nature of technology,
Hmm.
right? Is technologies are collections of new things that can be put together, and you have to figure out, assemble the parts, but then it's going to continue to evolve. It's a complicated, complex system, and the technology assessment can be part of the adaptive mechanism. Um, and a way of having a strategy of dealing with the new technologies, that if you don't have that analytical capacity, you don't have a strategy because you don't have any systematic way of keeping track of what's going on. And you don't, what I what I think was most crucial there was a stable set of staff who were really adept at doing that and being able to kind of stay in a domain and keep the political network and the technical
Hmm.
network connected to each other.
I know we introduced in our public interest technology degree a whole subject course dedicated to technology impact assessment, which you've championed from day one. Tell us, with respect to what you just said about skill sets, the types of people required. Okay, so we need people to stick around within, say, an OTA type of office or within technology assessment, but what are the skills that we're teaching our graduate students today with respect to potential jobs in this domain? What do they need to leave with, or what do they need to garner while they're in industry or while they're working for an office of TA? What makes them different?
So the yes, I love that question.
Yes,
Um, the skill sets, so it's really interesting. What I've done with the technology assessment course is, as I thought about it, and you actually did the original design, so you know this, but
yes, yes.
um, when I started teaching it, I decided that there were two things that the students needed to do. One was to observe how other people were doing technology assessment. So I
Mm,
had, there's a line of us, there's one assignment that emerged, which is basically you can't do a technology assessment as an individual in a compressed period of time. You just can't.
yes, yes.
An OTA project would take 18 months, and I had a
Mhm.
team of up to 21 working on these projects,
Wow.
and it took a while. and to do a good job. That was the Alzheimer's report. But, and I guess the Genome Project team was probably 7 or 8 people. But what they can do is read technology assessments and assess the assessments
Hmm.
and critically analyze how did they go about their work and what did they do well and what didn't they do well, and then go through example after example. And I've done that mainly by doing interviews of people who either do technology assessment or use it. And so they learn about basically case histories, which I think are an incredibly powerful teaching resource
Yes.
of how technology assessment worked in this domain or that domain, and do that by interviews with famous, important people that have done really interesting things. And so that's one track of the learning part. But
Yes.
the skill set that I thought was most important was applying that to the written assignment of being critical about technology assessments and picking a domain that the student knows something about, and then critique what somebody else has done or attempt to do it themselves, kind of a mini technology assessment. But that means the skill set is really the writing and the reading. And so there's a series of steps that start with name your topic, tell me which sources you've looked at, and let's get some feedback going about other things you might think about, and then do an outline and then write it. And the writing and policy memo in the middle, which
Hmm.
is that's a communication strategy. And the skills that I think were most important were the analytical married to the writing skills. And that's, I think, the most important skill set is technology assessment is basically amounting to writing reports, but not just stopping there, but also taking those reports and then translating them into a form that can be useful to somebody who's making a policy decision, whether that's in business or whether it's in government.
So when we started the conversation, you were talking about this when you first entered the OTA, that there were people from very different backgrounds. You were a doctor, others were likely public policy specialists, others historians. I imagine there were different skill sets completely. And learning to talk to different sectors, communicate with, up and down the chain, to Congress or to the community and via the media, perhaps. All of these stakeholders are involved in this process, and I guess this is for the benefit of the public who need to receive the message in a way that they can absorb it. So we're almost raising awareness. We're building capacity among citizens and consumers by that which we share, correct? Is that
Yeah,
what we're trying to do? So
yeah.
that,
So yeah, it's kind of like I think we're trying to help policymakers in particular at OTA at least, and the general public in general, we're trying to read the weather
hmm
and say, hey, there's a big storm coming and pay attention. Um, or I mean, the analogy I I more often use is trying to catch the wave,
yeah,
but you have to notice that the wave's building and and able to surf it. You have to see it and
yes,
you have to be ready for it when it gets there.
yeah.
So I think that's kind of what our job was when we're doing technology assessment right.
Can you ever get it wrong, Bob Cook-Deegan?
Oh
Technology
yeah.
assessment. What does that
Oh
look
yeah.
like, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, so I'll do a confessional here. My very first OTA report was actually not a full report; it was a background paper. It was on human gene therapy, um, because it was emerging, and there'd been a scandal that Martin Klein had tried to do gene therapy on a Kurdish girl and an Italian girl, and it had
Hmm.
it had caused a big controversy. So we were asked by the House of Representatives to do a report on human gene therapy, and it was super fun because it was a hot technology, and we could
Hmm.
get the world's best practitioners in one room and talk to other people. And it was really, really fun. Um, and it forced me to understand what was going on in the science and all that. So it was really, really fun. But two things happened out of that that were mistakes where I screwed up. Um, One was while this was going on, I was contacted by a photojournalist, a video journalist, to do a news thing. And I made the mistake of ending the interview by saying, "Oh, if Hitler had this, he would have done blah, 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 blah."
Right.
And I would not make that mistake now, but it's
Yeah.
just such a classic rookie mistake of hyping
Yeah.
how important what you're doing and bringing in Hitler. It's the
Yeah.
stupidest thing you can possibly do is take what could a really, really evil person do with this,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and create an unrealistic worst case scenario. I didn't actually explain that. I just raised the
Yes.
fear, right? But
Yes. Yes. Yes.
what a
Yes.
stupid rookie mistake. And that's how you learn.
Of course.
I don't think I've done anything quite that stupid since in
No,
a
you've always
video
been a
interview.
very sober academic as far as I've been aware, all your life.
But but the other thing was everybody, when that report came out, it got a lot of attention, and I was getting phone calls from journalists all over the place, and every one of them wants to know when's it going to happen. And at that point, the field
Mm,
thought that it was going to be maybe a year, maybe a
imminent,
year and a
yeah.
half
Hmm.
before the first clinical applications might be feasible, the first clinical trials, for example. Um, and that was off by 20 years and several catastrophes in the field.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
and there continue to be catastrophes. There was one just last week with
Hmm.
Duchenne's. Um, so, and what I should have held my ground and say, we just really, really can't predict.
That's
But
right.
I made some guesstimates of 18 months or 2 years to one or two of the interviews before I figured out I shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Um, so it's easy to overestimate the
Hmm.
precision of the kind of analysis that you can do. Um, and you're doing nobody any favors. We saw this mistake over and over again in the COVID crisis, right? Where we
Yes.
make definitive public health announcements that then change next week. And it just totally undermines the credibility overall of the whole enterprise and actually undermines the purpose of doing technology assessment in the first place.
Yes,
So
it's
so
fascinating
yeah, that
example.
you can screw it up, and I did.
It's a fascinating example because a lot of people also say they screwed up the timing of like how ChatGPT would transform certain practices, right? So it
Yeah,
works
AI
both
is going
ways.
through this big
Yeah.
time right now. Yeah.
That's right. And a lot of focus is on AI linked up with cybersecurity. And of course, this, which you alluded to, this complexity and adaptation of technologies coming together, through hybridization or recombination of existing devices or convergence. And this causing, like, what is a technology in technology impact assessment? How do we sort of identify technologies and their criticality without looking at other technologies they could be working with in order to do X or Y. So it is getting hard.
Yeah. And you mentioned AI. This is so interesting. So one of the things that we did, I guess, I'd been at OTA 2 or 3 years, and we got a request from one of the committees in the House, because even back in whatever this would have been, probably 1985 or six, there was already AI hype.
Yes.
And so one of the committees asked us, what's what's going on in AI? And because I was so interested in computers, they were also interested in whether it was going to implicate biotechnology and stuff like that. So there was this brand new, um, brilliant PhD who had just come from Caltech and joined us at OTA. She was an OTA fellow 2 years after I was, and her name was Arti Prabhakar.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the projects, we never did anything with it because this request didn't really turn into a real request. But we started looking at what's AI going to do, and should we do something about it at OTA? And so we never did eventually do that. But that was my first acquaintance with Artie Prabhakar, who of course went on to direct NIST and then directed DARPA and then became the president's science advisor. And she's one of the interviews for our course because
Fantastic.
this history of technology assessment. So that's the sort of thing. But AI is just your classic example
Yeah.
of you asked technologies as they evolve. Well, I mean, AI was even back in the days of McCarthy and
Hmm.
the first generation of so-called AI. It's been this promise, 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 but then suddenly a
Yeah.
commercial product comes out and completely changes the perception of the practicality of the technology. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I'm hoping a good historian of science and technology will do something on AI, but they can't write it for another 20 years, right?
That's right.
We're going to have
That's
to wait
right.
to see what happens.
That's right. And that is the joy of hindsight as we go on with our technology impact assessments, and they're live things that constantly are changing and morphing based on what's going on context-wise in the world. But on my last question is an open-ended question, Bob. I've enjoyed this interview so much, but is there anything else you want to add about technology impact assessment that's on your mind, um, that you've been thinking about, and or something that we haven't covered that you wanted to cover?
There's there's a hope, and it's only a hope, and right now it's an abject hope, um, that something along the lines of technology assessment could lead to a smoother and less contentious process for adapting new technologies for public good in the long term globally. Because the framework right now, and it's really intensified, it was intense in the early 80s in the rivalry between the US and Japan, which is when I went to OTA. Japan is number one. MIDI was this godlike powerhouse of industrial policy that was going to dominate the world, including biotechnology. And that went away a little bit, especially during the late 80s, early 90s, when the
Hmm.
internet was only hadn't even really emerged, and we were thinking of internet technologies as being democratic and liberating and powerful
Open.
ways of
Yeah.
distributing knowledge and making the world a better place. And before our cynicism began to grow. But I don't think it's wrong to think that properly structured, a global community of people thinking about where is technology leading, and technology is one of the reasons that we now live to be 80 years old instead of 45.
Yes.
And it's not it's not just antibiotics. I mean, it's mainly sanitation, it's transportation, it's all sorts of things that have been
Hmm.
gotten much better about human life, mainly because we think about things, we invent new things, and we make like incrementally better over
Yes.
time.
Yes.
And it would be nice if that process were not channeled through robust antagonistic nationalism in the framework exclusively of national competitiveness.
Yes.
And it would be nice to loosen those bonds a little bit. Those are going to be realities. And I don't want to seem naive here, but I do think there's a power in soft networks and people who are thinking about issues that can actually begin to communicate with each other. And science is usually pretty global. It's beginning to erode now. But it used to be that
Mhm.
you could go to a scientific meeting and it truly was global. There was only one science, there was only one molecular biology, and
Yeah.
people would do that wherever they did it. And you didn't care what country they came from as long
Hmm.
as they were doing good work. And I would like to think that technology assessment could be part of what would make that a long-term goal for
Yeah.
humanity. is let's smooth the process for emerging technologies and stop treating them, new technologies, purely as economic weapons. Um, so I realize that sounds somewhat naive, but
Absolutely not. I think that's where we're going. We have to go that way for the empowerment of humans in the world who want to see technological progress for good. As you say, I think that's the only way, but it takes intercultural communication. We're losing that which I think we knew we needed, but we need to do more of that in-person meeting. We need to be able to speak other people's language, not just in translation by discipline, but translation by cultural awareness and different belief systems that exist, different language. These are sometimes considered as hindrances to standardization or hindrances to the technology impact assessment process, but in fact, they're enriching. I think we need to do what we started the interview with, which is this communication, right? We need to translate beyond borders, so communicate knowing each other's intercultural and strengths, and we need to tap into those. But I think uh, as we're seeing these siloed uh, TIAs take place within one nation state for, as you mentioned previously, competitive processes to do with economics solely, well, it defeats the purpose of what we really mean by technology impact assessment. I think you're very right. And I love where we've ended this interview. I think it's something to strive for. And I love that you said soft networks, organically forming networks from the grassroots up. And I think that's exactly right. Science is not just for the elite. It's not just for those in the OTA office. It's not just for those in Congress, or it's not just for those who have the money to power it. It's for everybody. And that message you've provided us, I think, is beautiful and possibly going to be one of our final outcomes and milestones of this project. I do think this notion of community of practice, which is what we hope to form, actually has to be soft and has to be adaptive and has to be permeable
and it has to be global. The
and has
the
to be global, yes.
the one conceptual thing that I think is just so much getting in our way is we seem to be backing away from understanding their positive sum games. Everything is framed as a zero-sum game,
Yes.
and it's just so poisonous to, and that's what technology breaks,
Yes.
is developing technologies is precisely about enhancing positive sum games and repeating them over and over again. And somehow that's diminished in our culture, many cultures.
Yeah.
Um, and it's framed as us versus them and me versus him, and it's just awful. Yeah. So anyway, sorry, but
No, no. Actually, we've received some positive comments from people that look at global development in places in Africa, for example, that have this perspective, as you're saying, and it's a very different view to more developed countries, in terms of how they perceive development. And I think this goes at the heart of TIAs. So I thank you for that contribution, which I wouldn't have ended on, but I appreciate so much. It may well be one of the final outputs of our work from all the interviews we do. But Bob Cook-Deegan, it's always a pleasure. You have been such a wonderful friend and mentor at ASU from the day we held workshops together at Washington, D.C. office at ASU, and also all the things that you've shared with us in the school so openly, your work in the public interest technology area and your work in the TA. I mean, I've spoken to so many people and they say, I know Bob Cook-Deegan. I go, do you? Everybody knows Bob Cook-Deegan. So the fact that we were able to get this interview with regards to TIA has given us a view of what TIA as a practice within an office somewhere of technology assessment might look like, and may happen again in the US and elsewhere. I'm always hopeful, where there are people like yourself championing these spaces with others of the same experience and foresight. I think we can have these, no matter how bleak situations might look all over the world at different times. I think there's a resurgence in this field, and I look forward to seeing it through. Thank you so much.
thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
Love
Thank you,
seeing
Bob.
you. Thanks a
See
lot.
you.
Bye.
See you. Bye bye.